If you take a high-resolution drone shot of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, looking straight down from the sky, and you place it next to a microscopic photograph of a modern computer motherboard, something terrifying happens. They don't just look similar, they are geometrically identical. The nave corresponds to the data bus. The altar sits exactly where the central processor unit, or CPU, would be. The surrounding chapels mimic the arrangement of capacitors and resistors. The flying buttresses function exactly like heat sinks meant to disperse thermal energy. For centuries, we've been told these are houses of prayer, built by devout men with ropes and pulleys to get closer to God. But an engineer looking at these schematics sees something very different. He doesn't see a church, he sees a machine. He sees a gigantic, complex circuit board designed to manipulate invisible forces, laid out in stone and iron. And the most disturbing part isn't the resemblance. It's the realization that we have been walking through the carcass of a high-tech power plant for hundreds of years, treating its components like decorations, completely oblivious to the fact that we are standing inside a deactivated engine. By the end of this documentary, you're going to understand exactly what these structures were, how they worked, and why the knowledge of their operation was systematically erased from our collective memory. We're going to look at the physics of sound, the conductive properties of stone, and the atmospheric electricity that these towers were built to harvest. But before we can turn the machine back on, we have to admit that the story we've been fed about their construction is a mathematical impossibility. We have to look at the hardware itself. Let's begin with a simple thought experiment that destroys the mainstream narrative in about 30 seconds. Imagine you are a master builder in the year 1200. You have no electricity, no power tools, no cranes, and no advanced mathematics. Your workforce consists of illiterate peasants who believe the earth is flat. Yet, somehow, you decide to build a Cologne cathedral. This structure contains approximately 300,000 tons of stone. If you were to lay these stones in a single line, they would stretch from Berlin to Paris. Official history tells us this was done with hammers, chisels, and wooden carts. Let's run the numbers. To quarry, cut, transport, lift, and place just one block of granite weighing 5 tons requires a logistical chain that rivals modern shipping companies. Now multiply that by hundreds of thousands. If they placed one block every single hour, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without stopping for war, plague, or famine, the math still doesn't add up to the timelines we were given. But the timeline is the least of our problems. The real problem is the precision. When we examine the joints of these massive blocks in structures like the Baalbek Temple or the foundations of St. Petersburg, we don't find the rough, mortar-filled gaps you would expect from primitive hand tools. We find airtight seams. We find surfaces so perfectly flat that they adhere to each other through atmospheric pressure alone. This is not masonry. This is manufacturing. To achieve this level of tolerance today, we use computer numerical control, CNC, machines guided by lasers. We don't use chisels. You cannot chisel a perfect radius. You cannot hand polish granite to a mirror finish that reflects a laser beam without distortion. Yet, we are expected to believe that people who hadn't even invented the wheelbarrow managed to create geometric perfection that our best architects struggle to replicate with CAD software. This is the first crack in the illusion. The moment you stop looking at these buildings as art and start looking at them as industrial installations, the fog lifts. We're looking at the remnants of a civilization that didn't just stack rocks. They were printing with stone. They were molding geology like clay. The question nobody asks is, why? Why build so big? Why build so high? Why use granite and basalt, the hardest stones on Earth, which are notoriously difficult to work with, when limestone or brick would have been easier? If the goal was simply to house a few hundred people for a Sunday sermon, a wooden barn would have sufficed. A brick hall would have been luxurious, but they didn't build halls. They built resonance chambers. Granite is rich in quartz crystal. Quartz is piezoelectric. This is a scientific fact, not a theory. If you squeeze a piece of quartz, It generates an electrical charge. If you run an electrical current through it, it vibrates. This is how your watch works. It's how your radio transmitter works. Now look at the Great Pyramid. Look at the ancient cathedrals. They're almost exclusively built from or sitting on top of massive granite aquifers. They are mountains of organized piezoelectric crystal. When you construct a building out of millions of tons of conductive crystalline stone, you aren't building a tomb or a temple. You are building a battery. You are building a transducer capable of converting mechanical pressure from the weight of the stone itself or from sound waves into electromagnetic energy. The ancients didn't choose these difficult materials to make their lives hard. They chose them because they were the only materials that would make the machine work. You can't build a circuit board out of plastic, and you can't build a resonance harvester out of wood. This brings us to the most overlooked feature of this global architecture, the metal. If you look closely at the stones of the Parthenon, the Colosseum, or the megalithic walls of Peru, you will see strange holes. Archaeologists tell us these were for clamps to hold the stones together. But often, the metal is gone, harvested during the Great Meltdown of the 19th century. However, where the metal remains, it is almost always iron, copper, or a specific alloy. Why would you put iron clamps inside a stone wall that is already held together by gravity and perfect interlocking joinery? Structurally, it's redundant, but electrically, it changes everything. By inserting metal pins into conductive stones, you're creating a connected grid. You are wiring the building. The entire structure becomes a contiguous electrical conductor. This wasn't about stability. The stones were stable on their own. This was about continuity. They were ensuring the flow of current from the foundation to the spire. And let's talk about those spires. Have you ever noticed that every single ancient religious structure, from the stupas of India to the Gothic towers of Germany, ends in a sharp point? Often, these points were tipped with gold, silver, or copper, metals with the highest electrical conductivity. We are told these are architectural flourishes pointing towards heaven. That is a convenient poetic explanation for a functional component. In electrical engineering, a sharp metal point connected to the ground is known as a lightning rod, but also functions as an antenna. The Earth is a giant magnet. The atmosphere is a charged battery. The ionosphere, miles above our heads, is positively charged while the ground is negatively charged. Between them exists a constant vertical voltage gradient. We are literally walking around in an electric field of about 100 volts per meter. The higher you go, the stronger the potential. When you build a sharp conductive spire and push it high into the sky, you are physically piercing this atmospheric layer. You are creating a connection point for this atmospheric potential to ground itself. These spires weren't pointing to God. They were reaching for the grid. They were harvesting the static electricity of the atmosphere. In the intricate metal lattice work we see on the roofs of Victorian buildings, the fleur-de-lis patterns, the iron cresting, these aren't decorations. They are fractal antennas. Their geometric shapes are specifically designed to maximize surface area to capture specific frequencies. We use similar fractal designs in modern cell phone antennas today because they are the most efficient way to catch a wave. So, we have the battery, the granite, the wiring, the iron clamps, and the antenna, the spire. But a machine needs more than just power. It needs a function. It needs to do something. And this is where the mystery moves from electricity to acoustics. This is where we realize that these buildings weren't just gathering power, they were broadcasting. Walk into any Gothic cathedral and clap your hands. The sound doesn't just fade, it hangs, it rolls, it reverberates for 5, 6, sometimes 10 seconds. Modern architects view this as a nuisance. They spend millions adding sound-dampening foam to concert halls to stop the echo. But the ancients who could calculate the movements of the stars didn't make a mistake with the acoustics. They engineered the echo on purpose. The dimensions of these naves, the curvature of the apses, the specific height of the vaulted ceilings, they're all tuned frequencies. Just like blowing across the top of a glass bottle creates a specific note, these buildings were tuned to resonate at specific hertz frequencies. The OM of the Buddhist chants, the Gregorian chants of the monks, these weren't just artistic choices. They were activation keys. When a choir sings the right frequency in a tuned resonance chamber, the building reacts. The sound waves physically compress the quartz in the granite walls. The piezoelectric effect kicks in. The mechanical energy of the sound is converted into an electrical charge. The building literally lights up. We have accounts from the past of glowing stones and arcs of light inside these holy places. We dismiss them as religious hallucinations. But what if they were witnessing the ionization of the air caused by high-voltage static fields? But there is a missing piece to this hardware. A computer needs a cooling system, and a power plant needs a ground. If you look at the location of every major ancient cathedral, pyramid, or temple, you'll find one common denominator that is statistically impossible to be a coincidence. They're all built directly on top of underground water. Notre Dame is on an island in the Seine. The pyramids of Giza have massive subterranean aquifers and water channels beneath them. Chartres Cathedral sits on top of a deep well and a complex canal system. We are told this was for holy water or practical drainage, but an engineer knows that running water creates an electrical charge. It's called hydroelectricity, but even passive moving water creates a mild electromagnetic field. More importantly, water is the ultimate ground connection. By building on top of moving water, they were connecting the atmospheric charge from the spire through the conductive stone down into the Earth's currents. They were completing the circuit. They were plugging the building into the planet itself. The complexity of the underground tunnels found beneath these structures, often dismissed as catacombs or sewers, mirrors the complexity of the spires above. As above, so below, the root system is just as important as the branches. This leads us to the most uncomfortable realization of part one. If these were machines, built with a level of precision we can barely match, using a global understanding of physics we are just rediscovering, then who turned them off? And why does every single one of these structures show signs of having been stripped? When you look at the empty niches in the walls of the Vatican or the bare stone altars of Baalbek, you are looking at a computer tower with a graphics card and RAM ripped out. The statues and relics that used to sit in these niches weren't just idols. They were likely the active components, the capacitors, the coils, the magnets. We see drawings from the 1600s and 1700s showing these structures with strange spheres, metal grids, and devices that have since been removed or destroyed. We're living in a cargo cult. We inherited the shell of a Ferrari, but the engine is gone, so we are pushing it around by hand and praying to the hood ornament. We have taken the greatest technological grid in the history of the universe and turned it into a series of museums and mausoleums. But the shell remains, and the shell tells the story. The sheer density of these structures is another anomaly. In the 19th century, during the so-called Industrial Revolution, we saw a sudden explosion of buildings that looked exactly like ancient Greco-Roman temples, but were labeled as post offices, banks, and train stations. The Penn Station in New York, the grandiose capitals in every U.S. state. We are told that horse and buggy societies, struggling with dysentery and civil wars, decided to import marble from Italy and build structures with 40-foot columns just to sell stamps. It makes no economic sense. You don't build a palace to sort mail. You utilize an existing facility. Unless the facility was already there. Unless the founding fathers were actually the finding fathers. They didn't build these cities, they excavated them. They found the grid, dug it out of the mud, scrubbed off the grime, and repurposed the power plants into banks and government halls. They took the wireless energy grid and turned it into a control grid. This is why the photographs of the mid-19th century show empty cities. Look at the earliest photos of St. Petersburg, Washington, D.C., or San Francisco. You see grand, majestic boulevards lined with massive stone palaces, but the streets are made of mud. There are no people. There are no trees. There's just a ghost city and a few guys in top hats standing next to a shovel. They tell us it was early morning or long exposure times erased the people. But the shadows don't lie. The stillness is palpable. These photos are crime scene evidence. They show the moment of inheritance. The moment one civilization moved into the ruins of another. And what did they do with this inheritance? They systematically dismantled the tech. They removed the gold tips from the pyramids. They melted down the bells, not to make cannons, as the war stories claim, but because the bells were heavy with specific amalgams needed for the machine to resonate. They smashed the rose windows. Speaking of rose windows, those beautiful, circular stained glass masterpieces in every Gothic cathedral. Have you ever looked at the cymatic patterns of sound frequencies? If you vibrate a plate of sand at a specific hertz, it forms a complex geometric mandala. If you look at a rose window, it is a perfect cymatic pattern. It is a visual representation of sound frequency. But it's also something else. If you look at the cross-section of a magnetron, the device inside your microwave that generates electromagnetic waves, it looks exactly like a rose window. A central circular cavity surrounded by smaller circular cavities. Is it possible that these windows weren't just for pretty light? Is it possible they were the oscillation chambers for the energy collected by the towers? The glass itself in these windows is an anomaly. It often contains gold and metal nanoparticles. It is conductive glass. When the sun hits it, or when the building vibrates, the glass interacts with the field. We replaced most of it with cheap color modern glass after the wars, breaking the circuit. But the original glass was functional. We were just scratching the surface. We have established that the materials, granite, iron, the location, water aquifers, and the shape, spires/antennas, are all components of an electrical system. But a system needs software. It needs a way to be controlled. And it needs a medium to travel through. In the next part, we're going to dive into the software of this stone computer. We're going to explore the forbidden physics of the pipe organs, the bells, and the fluid dynamics that made this global energy grid function without a single copper wire. We will discover that the holy water was actually a chemical electrolyte, and that the hymns were the code that programmed the reality of the past. The machine is huge, and we have only just opened the front door. If the granite walls were the battery and the iron spires were the antennas, then sound was the key that turned the ignition. To understand this, we have to look at one of the most confusing and awe-inspiring machines ever built by human hands, the pipe organ. Walk into a modern church today, and you might see a small electronic keyboard or a modest piano. But if you walk into the great cathedrals of the old world, Notre Dame, Cologne, St. Stephen's, you are confronted with a monster. The great pipe organs are not musical instruments. They are industrial pneumatic power plants. Some of these machines contain over 30,000 pipes, some as small as a pencil, others as wide as a tree trunk and 3 stories tall. They require massive amounts of air pressure to operate, which in the past was generated by complex hydraulic water systems or teams of men operating bellows behind the walls. Ask yourself why? Why build a musical instrument that rivals the complexity of a steam engine just to play a hymn? Why do you need a bass note so deep that it operates at 16 hertz, a frequency the human ear literally cannot hear, but the human body can feel in its marrow? This is infrasound. In modern warfare, we research infrasound for crowd control and psychological impact. In the ancient world, they pumped it into the resonance chambers of cathedrals. When a great organ hits that low resonant frequency, it doesn't just make sound. It pressurizes the entire building. The air inside the cathedral compresses. The granite walls already under the tension of millions of tons of weight, begin to vibrate sympathetically. This is where the magic happens. The piezoelectric effect we discussed in part 1 is triggered not by random noise, but by a specific sustained mathematical frequency. The organ was the keyboard for the power plant. It was the frequency modulator. By playing the music of the spheres, the operator was literally tuning the building to the frequency of the Earth or the atmosphere. We have lost the sheet music for these machines. The songs we play today are likely simplified, hollow versions of the original operational code. But even now, when a master plays a Bach toccata on a cathedral organ, you feel a sense of awe that borders on fear. That is an emotion. That is physics. That is your body reacting to an electromagnetic field being manipulated by sound waves. But the organ was only the internal trigger. For external transmission, they used bells. And this is perhaps the greatest tragedy of the recent past. The history of the 18th and 19th centuries is filled with stories of confiscating church bells to melt them down for cannons. We are told that nations were so desperate for bronze to make weapons that they destroyed their own cultural heritage. This narrative falls apart when you analyze the metallurgy. Bell metal is a very specific alloy, high tin bronze. It is brittle. If you try to make a cannon out of bell metal, it will explode and kill your own gunners. It is terrible for weaponry, but it is perfect for one thing: holding a vibration. The ancients didn't just cast random bells. They cast bells of specific sizes, weights, and tonal qualities. The Tsar bell in Russia weighs 200 tons. The idea that this was just to call people to prayer is absurd. You don't need 200 tons of metal to tell peasants it's 12 o'clock. These bells were gigantic sound emitters. When rung, they created a torus field of sound that expanded outward from the tower. We know that sound can levitate matter. Acoustic levitation is a proven science today. We can float water droplets and small stones using ultrasonic waves. What happens when you scale that up? What happens when you have a 50-ton bell ringing in a tower designed to amplify that specific wave? Were these bells used to stabilize the atmosphere, to push away storms, or perhaps to transmit energy wirelessly to the surrounding city? It is no coincidence that the first thing every conquering army did, from the French Revolution to the Bolsheviks, was destroy the bells. They weren't gathering scrap metal. They were disabling the transmitters. They were silencing the grid. A silent population is easier to control than one vibrating at a high frequency. Now let's zoom out. If the cathedrals were the nodes, the CPUs of this system, what was the motherboard? To see that, we have to look at the ground itself. We have to look at the star forts. If you open Google Earth right now and start looking at the old cities of Europe, Asia, and even the Americas, you will notice a peculiar geometry. The city walls are not just walls. They are complex fractal stars. 11-pointed stars, 12-pointed stars, shapes that look like snowflakes. We call them bastion forts or star forts. The official explanation is that these shapes were designed to deflect cannonballs. They claim that the angled walls allowed for better crossfire. This is the military deception. While you could put a cannon on a star fort, the design itself makes no sense for defense. A complex star shape creates hundreds of blind spots. It requires exponentially more material to build than a simple circle or square. And many of these forts have no barracks, no weapon storage, and are located in places with zero strategic military value, in the middle of flat plains or on tiny islands far from shipping lanes. But if you take a metal plate, sprinkle sand on it, and vibrate it with a violin bow, an experiment known as Chladni figures, the sand arranges itself into geometric star patterns. The higher the frequency, the more complex the star. The shape of a star fort is not a military bunker. It is a cymatic signature. It is a frequency frozen in stone. These structures are often surrounded by water, moats that are shaped in the same star pattern. Water is the ultimate conductor of vibration. Victor Schauberger, the Austrian naturalist, proved that water has structure that it can hold energy when it moves in a vortex. The star forts were hydroacoustic machines. By channeling water through these specific geometric patterns, they were structuring the water, energizing it, and perhaps using the water itself to carry the frequency of the fort into the earth. We see star forts in the Netherlands, Naarden, in Japan, Goryeo in the USA, Fort McHenry, in India, in Russia. It is a global phenomenon. A unified world civilization built these structures using the same blueprint, ignoring national borders. And just like the cathedrals, they are built with impossible precision. The masonry of the granite walls dipping into the water is seamless. You cannot build a complex star-shaped island in the middle of the swamp with hand tools and keep it perfectly level. It's a terraforming project. The combination of the cathedral, the vertical antenna, and the star fort, the horizontal resonator, creates a complete system. The spire pulls the atmospheric charge down. The organ modulates the frequency. The bells project the wave, and the star fort grounds it into the water table, distributing the charge through the earth. It was a wireless energy grid that powered the antiquity. This explains the impossible lights described in ancient texts. The eternal lamps found in tombs that burned for thousands of years without fuel. The descriptions of cities that shone like the sun. They weren't burning oil, they were fluorescing. The atmosphere itself was charged. The very air was rich with ions. This might also explain the physical stature of the ancestors. We have legends of giants, of people living for hundreds of years. We know that electromagnetic fields affect biology. Experiments with electroculture in agriculture show that plants grown under a high-voltage wire grow 300% faster and larger without fertilizer. If the entire world was a giant electroculture garden, powered by these buildings, would humans grow larger? Will we live longer? But something broke the circuit. When we look at these buildings today, we notice something odd about their elevation. In Rome, in Paris, in London, and even in New York, we find mud flood windows. We see buildings where the front door is 5 feet below the current street level. We see first floors that have become basements. We see windows half buried in the sidewalk, leading into the dirt. Historians tell us this is cultural layer, that over centuries, dust and dirt just accumulated, and people were too lazy to sweep it, so they just paved over it. Think about how absurd that is. Does your house get buried in 6 feet of dirt over 100 years? No, road levels are maintained. You don't just let the ground swallow your first floor. This evidence points to a massive geological event, a liquefaction of the soil, a mud flood. At some point in the not-so-distant past, arguably mid-19th century, a catastrophe occurred that buried the bottom floors of these power plants. And what is on the bottom floor? The inputs, the water channels, the grounding cables, the air intakes for the organs. The system was clogged. The on switch was buried under 10 feet of clay. The star fort moats filled with silt. The aquifer shifted. The grid went down. And the survivors, or the inheritors, who found these cities didn't know how to unclog them. Or perhaps they didn't want to. They simply paved over the bottom floor, turned the second floor into the new entrance, and rebranded the power plant as a city hall. They took the free energy devices and turned them into administrative centers for tax collection. This transition from the etheric age to the combustion age is the great theft of human history. We went from a civilization that likely used clean, atmospheric resonance to a civilization that burns dead dinosaurs and coal. We moved from implosion, clean, cooling, ordering to explosion, dirty, heating, chaotic. Look at the fireplaces in these old mansions and castles. They're gigantic. You could stand inside them. But they have no flues, no chimneys that make sense for with smoke. They're often backed by metal plates. Were these really for burning logs? Or were they ionization points? Places where the atmospheric energy was concentrated to provide heat without fire? Radium heaters? We see photos of the world's fairs in the late 1800s. Buildings covered in millions of light bulbs before the power grid was supposedly built. They told us it was temporary generators, but the scale suggests otherwise. The World's Fairs, Chicago 1893, St. Louis 1904, San Francisco 1915, are the smoking gun. They claim to build massive Greco-Roman cities out of plaster and hemp in 18 months, hosted a party for 6 months, and then blew them up with dynamite. Does that sound logical? Or does it sound like a demolition operation? Does it sound like they found a remaining functioning sector of the old grid, let the public see it one last time under the guise of a fair, and then destroyed it to erase the evidence of what was once possible? In the Chicago World's Fair, they had moving sidewalks, electric incubators, and lights that turn night into day, all fueled by Tesla currents. Tesla didn't invent this tech. He rediscovered it. He was trying to hook back into the grid that the ancients built, and that is why he was shut down. JP Morgan didn't cut Tesla's funding because he couldn't afford it. He cut it because you can't put a meter on it. The ancient grid was decentralized. You couldn't charge for it. If the cathedral is broadcasting energy and your house has a receiving antenna, a chimney/spire, you have power. Free, limitless, clean. This is the enemy of the modern economic model. The scarcity matrix relies on the idea that energy is finite and must be dug out of the ground, refined, and sold back to you. So the knowledge was buried, literally and figuratively. The software was deleted. The music stopped. The organs were silenced or reduced to playing Sunday hymns. The bells were melted. The star forts were turned into tourist parks or overgrown ruins. But the hardware is still there. It's resilient. Granite doesn't rot. The geometry doesn't lie. And now that we know what to look for, we can see the cracks in the facade. We can see the architecture of control that was built on top of the architecture of freedom. In the next part, we are going to explore the timeline deception. We're going to look at the mathematical impossibility of the official history. We will look at the phantom years, the duplicated kings, and the evidence that this catastrophe, this reset, happened much more recently than we are allowed to believe. We're going to find out just how fresh the mud really is. The machine is off, but the manual is emerging from the dust. We are standing on a timeline that has been broken, stitched back together, and smoothed over with a layer of academic plaster. If the physical evidence of the cathedrals and star forts suggests a civilization of superior technology, then the historical narrative must explain where they went. The official story is one of linear progress. We started in caves, invented the wheel, went through the dark ages, discovered steam, and here we are with iPhones. But when you zoom into the transition period, specifically the mid-19th century, roughly 1840 to 1900, the linear line snaps. The data points don't connect. The logic creates a paradox. This period is the uncanny valley of human history. It is an era filled with impossible construction, impossible destruction, and a population that seems to have appeared out of thin air without parents. Let's look at the Great Fires. Between 1870 and 1906, nearly every major city in the Western world burned to the ground. Chicago, 1871. Boston, 1872. Seattle, 1889. San Francisco, 1906. The official story is always the same. A cow kicked a lantern, a glue pot boiled over, a curtain caught fire. And somehow, these minor accidents turned into infernos that melted steel, pulverized granite, and turned thousands of acres of stone buildings into dust. Look at the photos of the aftermath of the San Francisco earthquake and fire. You don't see the charred remains of wooden houses. You see the skeletal remains of massive neoclassical stone palaces. You see steel beams twisted like pretzels. Wood fires do not melt structural steel. Wood fires do not pulverize brick into powder. The destruction looks less like a fire and more like a carpet bombing. It looks like a directed energy weapon was used to level the grid. And what happened next is even more miraculous. We are told that within 10 to 20 years, these cities were rebuilt bigger and grander than before. Seattle was supposedly raised up by 12 feet. Chicago built the White City for the World's Fair just 20 years after being wiped off the map. Who built this? With what money? With what labor force? This brings us to the foundling anomaly. If you look at the census data and the social movement to the mid to late 1800s, you see a terrifying spike in the number of orphans. We have the phenomenon of the orphan trains in America, where hundreds of thousands of children were put on trains in the East Coast and shipped to the Midwest to be adopted by farm families for labor. Where did hundreds of thousands of children come from? Where were their parents? A society doesn't just misplace a generation of adults unless a catastrophic event removed them. Were these the survivors of the reset? Were these the children left behind after the mud flood or the conflict that silenced the grid? Even more disturbing are the incubator exhibits at the world's fairs. In the late 1800s, premature babies were not treated in hospitals. They were shown as attractions at fairs. At Coney Island and the world's fairs, you could pay a ticket to see hundreds of babies in glass machines. We are told this was medical innovation, but a cynical eye asks, why were there so many parentless babies? And why were they being raised by the state in glass boxes? This paints a grim picture of a repopulation program. A society of inheritors, raised in institutions, educated by a new system to believe in new history. They were told that the magnificent ruins they were repairing were built by Romans or Greeks thousands of years ago, or by their own immediate ancestors who were supposedly supermasons. They were given a history book that erased the free energy grid and replaced it with the struggle for coal and oil. This is why the Industrial Revolution feels so forced. We are supposed to believe that for thousands of years, humanity rode horses, and then suddenly, in a 50-year span, we invented the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, electricity, the combustion engine, the airplane, and the camera. It's a vertical spike in the graph. The alternative hypothesis is that we didn't invent these things in the 1800s. We found them. We reverse engineered them. The inventors we worship, Edison, Bell, Marconi, might have been the patent clerks of the reset. They were the ones who figure out how to turn the leftover machines back on, or how to rewire them for profit. Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb. He figured out how to make a filament that burned out so he could sell you another one. The original tech was likely eternal. The centennial light in California has been burning for 120 years. That is a remnant of the old manufacturing. The new manufacturing is designed for planned obsolescence. This narrative of inheritance and deception explains the phantom time hypothesis. Mathematicians like Anatoly Fomenko have argued that our chronology is wrong, that the Middle Ages didn't happen, or that history has been stretched to fill the gap. When you look at the royalty of Europe, you see duplicate stories. King, it is exactly what King B did 300 years apart. The names change, but the events are statistically identical. This suggests that the historians needed to fill the void left by the missing civilization. They took the history of the empire, Tartaria, Rome, whatever you call it, chopped it up, and spread it out over 1,000 years to make it look like a natural progression of Dark Ages to Enlightenment. They needed to hide the fact that humanity was actually more advanced in the past. The term Dark Ages is an inversion. It wasn't dark. It was likely the age of light, of illuminated cathedrals and free energy. The darkness is now. We're the ones living in the smog, burning matter to boil water to spin turbines. We're the ones digging holes in the ground like primitives. And nowhere is this cover-up more obvious than in the classification of the architecture itself. Go to any American city, Nashville, Indianapolis, San Francisco. You will find a Capitol building with a golden dome. It looks exactly like St. Peter's in Rome or St. Isaac's in Russia. They tell us it was built in 1850 by cowboys and settlers. Look at the Salt Lake City Temple. The Mormons claim they built it in the desert, hauling massive granite blocks with ox carts while fighting Indians and starving. The structure is an engineering masterpiece of granite precision. The timeline of construction, 40 years, is used to explain the impossibility, but the logistical reality remains absurd. It is far more likely that they found the temple. They excavated it, and then they claimed it. This pattern repeats globally. The colonial architecture in India, Australia, South Africa, and Canada is all identical. A post office in Mumbai looks like a post office in Ottawa. They tell us this is the British Empire style. But maybe the Empire didn't build it. Maybe the Empire just put their flag on it. Maybe this was a global, unified civilization, a one-world order of the past that was shattered. The reset explains the cultural amnesia. It explains why we feel a strange nostalgia when we look at these buildings, a feeling of we used to be greater. It explains why modern architecture is so ugly. We lost the math. We lost the connection to the sacred geometry. Modern buildings are boxes of glass and steel, disconnected from the earth, designed to isolate us. The old buildings were machines designed to connect us. The asylums of the 19th century are another dark piece of this puzzle. Massive, castle-like structures, capable of housing thousands, often with the most advanced heating and ventilation systems. In the 1800s, they were filled with the insane. But who were these insane people? Were they the traumatized survivors of the cataclysm? Were they the people who remembered the old world and refused to accept the new narrative? The Soviet Union used psychiatric wards to imprison dissidents. It is highly probable that the new regime of the 19th century used these insane asylums, which were actually repurposed healing centers or universities of the old world, to warehouse the people who knew too much. They re-educated the children in the orphanages and locked away the adults in the asylums. Within one generation, the truth was gone. The Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, the Crystal Palace, a structure made entirely of glass and iron, appearing out of nowhere. It housed the wonders of the world. Then it conveniently burned down. The records were lost. The artifacts destroyed. This is the cleanup operation. We are walking through a crime scene that has been scrubbed, but they missed spots. They missed the cymatic patterns in the church windows. They missed the conductive iron in the megaliths. They missed the star forts hiding under the golf courses. And most importantly, they couldn't scrub the intuition of the human spirit. We know, deep down, that the story of primitive man evolving into space-age man is a lie. We feel the degradation. We see the pollution. We see the inefficiency of our combustion technology compared to the elegance of the stone ruins. We are not at the peak of civilization. We are in a post-apocalyptic survival mode, trying to understand the magic of our ancestors. The timeline deception was necessary to maintain the scarcity matrix. If people knew that energy was once free, that health was maintained by frequency, and that the world was once unified, they would not accept the current system of debt, war, and fossil fuels. They would demand the switch be turned back on. But can we turn it back on? Or is the machine too damaged? Is the atmosphere too polluted? Have we lost the keys forever? In the final part of this documentary, we're going to look at the future. We will look at the scientists who are quietly rediscovering this tech. We will look at the modern evidence of atmospheric energy harvesting. And we will answer the ultimate question. If we're living on the dump of an abandoned civilization, how do we stop being parasites and start becoming builders again? The truth is not in the history books. The truth is in the stone. We have stripped the machine down to its bones. We have identified the chassis, the granite cathedrals, the wiring, the iron bands, the antenna, the spires, the software, the organs and bells, and the grounding system, the water and star forts. But every engine needs a fuel. Even a passive harvesting system needs a medium to spark the reaction. And this brings us to the most toxic and forbidden substance in alchemy, mercury. If you dig deep into the legends of the ancient Vimanas of India, or the construction of the Chinese Emperor's Tomb, or the subterranean chambers of Teotihuacan in Mexico, you find one recurring element: rivers of mercury, liquid metal. In 2015, archaeologists discovered large quantities of liquid mercury in a tunnel beneath the temple of the feathered serpent in Mexico. They called it a ritual representation of water, but an engineer knows that mercury is not water. It is a heavy, conductive liquid metal. In the Vedic texts, the propulsion system of the flying machines was described as a mercury vortex engine. Why mercury? Because when you spin mercury in a closed loop and electrify it, you create a powerful magnetic field. It is the perfect medium for an electromagnetic dynamo. Now look at the top of the ancient spires and the domes of the capitals. Many of them had hollow balls or vessels at the very tip. We are told these were decorative time capsules. But what if they were originally filled with red mercury or a mercury amalgam? A mercury-filled vessel at the top of a spire, connected to the iron grid, vibrating from the organ below, would function as a signal amplifier of massive power. It would create a plasma field. It would glow. The halo we see in religious paintings, the glow around the heads of the saints, might not be spiritual. It might be a depiction of the electromagnetic corona discharge that surrounded the people who operated these machines. They were the technicians of the light. This brings us to the ether. To make this entire system work, to transmit energy wirelessly from a tower to a street lamp or a home, you need a medium. Sound travels through air. Waves travel through water. What does electricity travel through when there are no wires? Up until the early 20th century, every major scientist, including Newton and Maxwell, believed in the ether. It was the invisible fabric that permeated the universe. It was the water in which our reality floated. The ancient tech worked by manipulating the pressure of the ether. Then, suddenly, the ether was canceled. The Michelson-Morley experiment allegedly proved it didn't exist. Einstein's theories took over, and physics became about particles and relativity, not about the unified field. Why? Because if the ether exists, then energy is everywhere. It is in the empty space between your hands. It is free. If you admit the ether exists, you admit that you don't need a power plant to burn coal. You just need an antenna to tap into the ambient sea of energy. Killing the ether was the final nail in the coffin of the old world technology. By removing the concept from our textbooks, they ensured that no modern engineer would ever accidentally figure out how the pyramids worked. We're trying to understand a submarine without knowing what water is. But the cover-up is cracking. The cracks are forming because of us. The internet has created a distributed brain that is far more powerful than any burning of the Library of Alexandria. We are crowdsourcing the archaeology. A kid in Russia takes a photo of a basement. A researcher in Brazil matches it to a star fort, and an engineer in Germany explains the physics. We are reassembling the blueprint. We are beginning to see the Capitol buildings for what they are. Capital comes from capacitor. The dome is the dielectric. The columns are the cathodes. The fascination with fasces, the bundle of rods found in the US Congress and on old currency, is not just a symbol of authority. It is a schematic for a bundled wire or a magnetic core. They put the symbols right in our faces. So what do we do with this knowledge? There are two ways to look at the mud flood and the reset theory. The first is despair. You can feel angry that we are living in a post-apocalyptic wasteland ruled by parasites who stole our heritage and sold it back to us. You can feel small, knowing that we are children playing in the ruins of giants. But there is a second option: empowerment. If our ancestors built this, then it is in our DNA. We're not a species of warmongering apes who only know how to destroy. We are a species of builders. We are a species of resonance. The fact that we feel sick in concrete boxes and alive in stone cathedrals proves that our biology is still tuned to the old frequency. We are dormant, not broken. The Great Reset that everyone is afraid of in the future, maybe it's already happened. Maybe we are the survivors of the last reset, and we are currently in the rebuilding phase. And this time we have a choice. We can continue to build a civilization based on explosion, combustion, and scarcity. We can continue to dig holes in the ground and burn the blood of the earth. Or we can remember. We can look at the church spire and see the antenna. We can look at the star fort and see the battery. We can demand that science returns to the study of the ether, of vibration, of frequency. We can stop accepting the mystery narrative and start demanding the engineering specs. The elites of the 19th century, the robber barons, didn't build the world, they hijacked it. They put meters on the free wires. They turned the temples into banks, but they couldn't destroy everything. The stone is too heavy. The geometry is too pervasive. The truth is literally set in concrete. We are finding the on switch. It isn't a lever in a hidden room. The on switch is our perception. The moment you stop seeing a tomb and start seeing a power plant, the machine turns on in your mind. You stop being a passive tourist and become an active investigator. The Earth is not an exhausted quarry. It is a sleeping giant. The grid is still there. The water still flows under Chartres. The granite still vibrates in Giza. The ionosphere is still charged with millions of volts. The hardware is ready. It is waiting for the software. And the software is us. Our consciousness, our unified intent, our ability to resonate together. That might be the final key that the parasites couldn't replicate. They could steal the stones, but they couldn't steal the vibe. They can wear the robes, but they can't sing the song. We're the operators. It's time to clock back in. Look, if this documentary just shattered your worldview, if you were looking at the buildings in your city differently today than you were 20 minutes ago, then you are exactly who I am looking for. Because here is the reality. The algorithm hates this video. The mainstream history channels do not want this information trending. They want you watching videos about primitive tool making and political drama. They want you asleep. I am building a community of researchers, thinkers, and engineers who are done with the fairy tales. Every single week, I am digging into the archives, analyzing the anomalies, and breaking down the forbidden history that they tried to erase. Next week, we are going to expose the world's fair lie in detail, showing you the blueprints that prove those buildings were thousands of years old, not temporary plaster. So if you want to be part of the excavation, if you want to know the truth about where we really came from and what we are truly capable of, you need to hit that subscribe button right now. Click the notification bell so you don't miss the evidence. They buried the past. Let's dig it up together. I'll see you in the next investigation.